Os, welcome to these conversations. It's terrific to have you back in Australia and to have this chance to talk. I am deeply invested in this country. I love it very dearly. And I'm deeply worried, I have to say, to see that the data reflects something of how it seems out there. We're living in times of unprecedented breakdown in trust. The trust deficit in Australia now in our parliaments, in our politicians, in our major institutions, financial and otherwise, is in uncharted waters. At the same time, we seem to be polarising. The research shows that more Australians than ever are identifying with the political extremes, particularly the left, but also the right. And the middle, in the land of the fair go, we've always believed that Jack's as good as his mate, the middle's being squeezed. And I don't think this is just Australian. What's happening to the Western democracies?
Well, you're touching on a whole number of things there, John, but just start with trust. You can see the reasons at various levels. On the one hand, many of our institutions, from the political ones to the church ones, have misbehaved, and they've squandered whatever credibility and trust they should have had. But then at a different level altogether, we've got contemporary philosophies like Post-modernism. Nothing is what it appears to be. There's always an agenda behind what's being done or said. So with Postmodernism, we're all schooled in suspicion and cynicism and mistrust. Or again, at the very simplest level, trust is a matter of each one being a person of their word. And I don't mean huge things like, say, a marriage vow, till death do us part. That's massive. But I mean simple things. See you at 11 tomorrow, or let's have lunch. If I don't turn up, or I'm always an hour late, I will not be seen as a man of my word. But when in the simplest things we do what we say and we deliver what we promise, then we become predictable to other people, and that creates the social capital of trust. So trust is broken down in our advanced modern societies at all sorts of levels. And those of us who are followers of Jesus have to know how to begin, in our very simple things like being people of our word and turning up when we say and delivering on our promises and so on.
So one aspect of this that particularly interests and concerns me, because I've spent a lot of time in the Australian Federal Parliament, is that when trust breaks down, when people don't do what they ought and feel others are not doing what they should do, one of the responses is that inevitably you end up with more laws and more regulations and more control, which seems to strike at the heart of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Lord Moulton well put it, the freedom is obedience to the unenforceable. In other words, freedom requires a framework, and the only appropriate framework for freedom is self-restraint, not external restraint. You're restrained by someone outside you, you're not free. But the trouble is when freedom breaks down, license, permissiveness, whatever it is, people think, oh, we've got to have new rules and regulations, and then you lose freedom. You've got to teach truth and character and virtue, loyalty, honesty, and so on, to really know that people are living free and they don't need external regulations.
Well, we live in a country where, and one of my neighbours said it to me the other day, he said, well, freedom's here to stay. We're Australians. That's the way we do it. And it has been. We've had a very laissez-faire approach. We've always taken the view that even if I disagree with my mate down the road, if he wants to do something unusual or odd, as long as it doesn't interfere with me, that's fine. But it reflects something. We live in this wonderfully free country. We didn't have to fight for it. We fought vigorously, and we're very proud of the way we fought to defend freedom. But unlike many cultures, we didn't have to fight for it in the first place. We didn't shed our own blood in terrible cataclysmic events to establish freedom.
If you look at the English-speaking world, America's rather different. Their revolution was by intention and by ideas. But if you look at Britain, Australia, Canada, and much of the rest of the English-speaking world, it just sort of came organically. It was there, and we accepted it as sort of in the water supply or whatever. But now we've got ideas that are really alien. So if much of English-speaking freedom basically came out of the Bible and a Christian background, Today, many of the radical ideas on the liberal left come from the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and its heirs, such as Nietzsche and Michel Foucault, and they are very different ideas, and they are undermining all that we used to accept. And we've got to be aware of that, because if they win, finally, and at the moment they are winning certain spheres, such as the university world, the press and media, and the entertainment world, but if they win culture-wide, freedom as we've known it in the English-speaking world will be a thing of the past.
And that brings me to the point, and you've written a great deal about this, that it seems right to say, well, we've taken it for granted. We don't think about it. It's a bit like eyesight. It's just there and it's wonderful, and we assume it'll always be there. But perhaps we need to ask ourselves some hard questions. What is, in the classical Western Judeo-Christian and Enlightenment view, the nature of freedom? What is freedom?
Mm-hmm. You know, it was once said, a rose is a rose is a rose. And people think, you know, freedom is freedom is freedom. But you can see there are many, many different views of freedom, and many of them are unsupported, and they lead in very disastrous directions. And so we haven't time to go into it in great depth, but one of the differences is freedom internal or external. Most modern freedom, external only. Whereas Jews, Christians, most people in religion would say freedom has to start internally in the heart. Jesus would say that. Or another huge distinction is between negative and positive. And Isaiah Berlin, negative freedom is freedom from, and anyone constrained by anyone or anything outside themselves is not free, whether it's alcohol or drugs or a bully or a colonial power. They're not free. You need negative freedom, freedom from. And we Christians say that starts with redemption and salvation, freedom from sin and its power. But then positive freedom is freedom for, freedom to be, and that requires and assumes truth, which again is an unpopular topic today. But a strong biblical view of freedom includes both the negative and the positive, and not just one or the other, whereas modern views tend to be the negative only, libertarian views, and people think that's enough. It isn't. So we've got to contribute to the discussion of saying what actually is freedom. Let's be clear about what we mean, and where's it grounded? For example, the Greeks, the Romans, the Assyrians and the Babylonians in the Old Testament say, or modern atheists who are determinists through naturalistic science, they have no grounding of freedom. For the Greeks, we weren't free, we were fated. You know, with modern naturalists, we're not free, we're determined. You read a thinker like, say, Sam Harris, one of the so-called new atheists, freedom is a fiction. And that's very common among secularists. In fact, it's only Jews and Christians, because of the Bible, that have a strong grounding for freedom. God is sovereign. He's truly free. We're not sovereign. We're significant, though, and freedom is that gift of God through which we most resemble our God himself.
I had a very vigorous discussion quite recently with a young man, product of one of our better universities in this country, and he was very angry with me. He said, "You're being incredibly exclusive, saying that's only the Judeo-Christian creed that is committed to the idea of freedom and, if you like, the concept that it's based on in Judeo-Christianity of the individual value, the worth and dignity of every individual." He says it's common to all of the great creeds and religions.
That's absolute nonsense. I mean, I just mentioned Sam Harris. You could go to J.B. Watson, B.F. Skinner, numerous others. I mean, Jacques Monod, chance and necessity. You know, you cannot find freedom in the new atheists. And tell your friend to look, read the books.
Well, he did. You know what he said?
What?
It's the standard thing. He said to me, "Well, I've got my tablet here. I'm going to look it up right now." And so he tapped in freedom in a certain other religion. And of course, nothing came up.
But
that didn't discourage him. There was a mindset there that was reluctant to engage in the debate.
I studied under a guru when I was in my 20s. You know, the Hindus talk of moksha. That's the Sanskrit word for freedom. But what does it mean? It's freedom from individuality, not freedom to be an individual. In other words, they talk of freedom, but it's transcending this life. And just as salt merges in water, the river flows into the sea, so we lose our individuality, which is caught in the world of illusion, and we go round and become one with the ground of all being. Well, that is freedom as they understand it. But that's a very different thing, say, from biblical freedom, which is freedom for the individual to be whoever God has created them to be, a very solid view which gives you also political freedom. You know, and our Western freedom owes a huge amount to Exodus. Let my people go. You know, the first example of the consent of the governed in Exodus. All that the Lord says, we will do. The first separation of church and state. You had the monarchy, the priesthood, and the prophet. And the prophet was the countercultural social critic holding the other leadership people and their feet to the fire. You could go down the line. Many of the things that are basic to Western freedom you can find in the Torah, and particularly in the book of Exodus. So the nonsense that everyone believes the same thing, it just collapses when you actually look at the differences.
So to dig into this a bit more, it seems to me that this modern sort of view that's taking hold, it's being pushed through our educational systems and so forth, and young people, little awareness of our own cultural history and so forth. The actual results, again, in the data are quite concerning. If we talk negative freedom, freedom from, forget about political oppression or not having the rule of law for a moment, talk about freedom from in a personal sense. The data suggests that an awful lot of young people are now not free, tragically. Anxiety, depression, fear, addiction in its many guises. To be bound to any of those, I would have thought, is to not be free.
Mm-hmm. Classically, it's always said that the first danger to freedom is external. Yes. You find someone stronger than you, a country or a person who's out to beat you up or whatever. But the second danger to freedom is internal, and it comes through the corruption of freedom. So freedom becomes permissiveness, becomes license, becomes addiction. Or free people love to be safe, secure, so they want to be so secure, they surround themselves with it. One nation under surveillance, they're no longer free. Big Brother watches everything. Or they love freedom so much, they will fight to the death for freedom, sacrifice for freedom, and they'll do anything, even things that contradict freedom. So Americans say in Iraq, you think of the incredible things they did there of torturing the Iraqi prisoners, things that were an open denial of American freedom. But I say to my American friends, they call themselves the land of the free, but they are the land, they have more addicts, they have more recovery groups than any other nation in the world because their freedom has spiraled down to addictions.
I had 19 years in the Australian Parliament representing a rural electorate, and one of the things that people used to often say to me, I think it's a way of expressing the same thing. I don't know whether they still do it, my successors get it, but very often if I had a meeting in the bush, so to speak, which is what we call the country in this part of the world, someone would say, I'm really worried now about the way we never stop talking about our rights, but you've got to balance it with our responsibilities. Isn't that a way of saying that if you want your rights to continue, you've got to be responsible in how you use them, personally and
absolutely.
in society?
In other words, rights assume and require duties and responsibilities. And you can see in the book of Exodus, the heart of the covenantal system that they signed on to was a mutual responsibility of everyone for everyone. You love your neighbor as yourself. Well, out of those responsibilities, the neighbor had rights. But today it's all rights, no responsibility, and the notion of entitlement is incredibly selfish. And so we're in a rather dangerous position.
Yeah, I do worry about this idea of identity politics. where it seems that it's very easy now to be somehow elevated above the pack if you can describe yourself as a victim. And when you're a victim, you're owed. Somebody else should fix it up for you. It usually starts with the government's got to. If the government doesn't, then the victim says, well, I'm hated. I really am a victim. You're confirming it. If someone does try and meet that need, there's no thankfulness because it was an entitlement.
Mm-hmm. No, victim politics is catastrophic. You know, you think of, say, our Jewish friends. They were genuinely victims. 6 million under Hitler. But they realized to play the victim card was self-defeating, because those who perceive themselves as victims and then portray themselves as victims, victim politics, eventually paralyze themselves as victims, and that's the danger. So certainly those who are followers of Jesus, you know, they talk about homophobia, Islamophobia, and there was a group in the US who said Christians, when they're attacked, should play the Christophobia card. And I say, no, that's dreadful. You know, our Lord told us to pick up our crosses and follow him. Christians should be broad-shouldered through cross-carrying. So we should never play the victim cards. If we catch you in the neck because we're faithful, he called that part of what it means to follow him. So victim politics is absolutely self-defeating and disastrous. The Jews understood that quickly, and Christians should follow them. It's a terrible way of approaching. You know, the background, as you say, though, is the ideological multiculturalism. In other words, people are individuals, but they're members of groups. But multiculturalism thinks only in groups. And then you have tribal politics, and then you have victim politics. So
you emphasise the difference rather than the things we have in common,
yeah,
which is a disaster, I think, in a democracy.
And you don't listen to an individual. So I'm a white male, an older white male, so immediately you're put in a category. Anything you say is dismissed as you're bound to be that. I might have views that are quite different, but no matter, you're immediately put like that. And so it's a dreadful way of discussing society. We are individuals, and people have voices. They should be given a hearing. They're right and wrong and listened to, and so on. So we should crack the political correctness of victim politics and identity politics.
One of the interesting things about these conversations we're putting together, a library, if you like, of, I hope, quality content that people can access easily, is we're talking to people from a variety of backgrounds. And I recently spoke to a man of the left in this country that I respect very greatly, a very clear thinker. He's been writing extensively on the importance of freedom of speech, for example. And he made the observation to me that the Labor Party that he joined many, many years ago was committed to universalism, and saying that the weak, the oppressed, the disadvantaged should be fully, if you like, brought into the family of Australians. No more, no less, universalism. And he decries identity politics because it says it's creating a new elite. And as part of that, often we're missing the most marginalised of all, the people who really need the help. Mm-hmm. It's almost a sort of the squeaky wheel gets the oil.
Yeah. No, in the postmodern world is a world without truth, where the principle is now power. And so what we're talking about, identity politics and so on, is a power tool to silence voices they don't like, and they overlook the marginalized. And I always say, who were the first strong voices on behalf of the oppressed and the poor and the people no one cared about? They were the Hebrew prophets. Amos and Micah and Hosea and Isaiah and Jeremiah and so on. And thank God they tackled it. In other words, they tackled the elite, the kings and various people like that, because they ignored who cared for a widow? God did. And the prophet speaking on his behalf, they cared too. So Christians should be in the forefront of those things, because they are the forgotten people and the marginalized people. And there are many on the left who still care for that, but left-wing politics at large simply doesn't.
Well, to come to another man of the left who thinks very, very clearly, England's Frank Furedi, seen a lifetime of left-wing activism on campuses, and says that in the 60s we were about expanding people's minds, young people were testing the boundaries. Now they're being, if you like, pushed into a cookie-cutter mould where they dare not differ, and indeed whole courses seem to be designed in universities to avoid offending. So they're not about teaching and exploring and expanding our understanding of truth. They're about if you like, avoiding offence and staying safe. But he made a very interesting observation coming to the issue of how we think about the framework, the legislative framework for societal freedom. And he said that the first freedom wasn't the way we often talk about it, the right to speak. He was quite adamant about it. He said, no, the first freedom was conscience. We learnt to stop doing terrible things to people who held a minority view. Mm-hmm. And he said, I think he made the observation very unwise anyway, because one day the people with a minority view might be in the majority, and you don't want them to turn around and do to the old majority, the new mm-hmm. minority, what they'd suffered. Mm-hmm. But I think this idea of burning people at the stake because they had a minority view, we rightly see as repulsive. So perhaps the definition of, or an understanding, a starting point for understanding the legislative framework for freedom is to say that it ought to seek to ensure that no one faces sanctions for holding and expressing a minority view. Is that a workable concept?
Of course. And you know, the American alternative term for freedom of religion and conscience is the first liberty. In other words, you take the basic three, conscience, speech, and assembly or association. There's no hierarchy and they're all interlocked. But freedom of association assumes that you want to get together with people to speak to them about something that matters. And equally, freedom of speech assumes that while you could, if you get together, talk about the weather if you want to talk about things that matter to you supremely because you're convinced of them based on the dictates of conscience. In other words, the one that's the deepest logically, and also the first historically, is freedom of conscience. It's the first liberty. But in a secular society, people believe freedom of the press, freedom of the speech, that's the first. No, conscience is the first. Now, if you look at it historically, and we who are followers of Jesus have to be honest over this, the first voices were Christian. Tertullian, the 2nd century. Then Lactantius, who's very important because he was the tutor to the Emperor Constantine's son. And the Emperor Constantine was the man who gave the Edict of Milan, which was the first great edict of toleration, probably affected by Lactantius. In other words, their idea was simple. A free God invites people to believe in him freely and worship him freely. So you grant freedom of conscience. But then sadly, when the church came into power, there were terrible notions like error has no rights, and then later practices like the Inquisition, the forced baptism of the Jews, horrendous and evil. Although that notion, error has no rights, you hear among the new atheists today. But modern freedom of conscience came in the 17th century from the nonconformists, Thomas Howells, Roger Williams, William Penn, people like this. And so Christians should be proud of the fact that freedom of conscience, which came from these great people of faith, is one of the contributions to modern human rights. But freedom of conscience is the first freedom.
This is important in Australia at the moment because following the legalisation of same-sex marriage, the Prime Minister determined that, in his words, freedom of religion was even more important than the marriage question, and he was supporting same-sex marriage, and we'd have an inquiry into it. So we've had an inquiry, and as you and I talk, that's before the government, they're going to consider it. Many Australians might say, well, we agree with freedom of religion, and in fact, the surveys show that they think it's important. But I wonder whether they would say, well, actually, it's perhaps, if you like, underneath this inquiry lies fundamental issues that are even more important than the great policy debates at the moment when they think about their jobs and their security in economic terms and all of those sorts of things. In other words, freedom of religion really can't be separated, in my view, from freedom of conscience and belief. There may be many Australians who might say, I'm not actually religious, but there are no Australians who would say, I don't have a conscience and I don't have beliefs. They really all belong together. This inquiry goes to the heart, I would have thought, of our right to speak to the things that are most dear and important to us, and to be heard with respect, and to keep in mind that my view might be a minority today, but it might be a majority view tomorrow. These things change.
I always refer to freedom of religion and conscience and put the two together, because the problem is the word religious freedom, which obviously includes conscience, was coined at a time when pretty well everyone was religious. But in our society, with the diversity of religions and the growth of atheism, religious freedom sounds like, or can be made to sound like, freedom for the religious. Yeah. And it's not. It's freedom for everybody at that level of conscience, because everybody believes something.
Well, there are certainly those who would say then that religion should be a purely private matter and not be allowed into the public square, so to speak. And yet I would argue that, yes, it's certainly true that there are stains on the record of Christians and their behaviour down through the centuries, but there are also magnificent things. So there was enormous opposition, say, to William Wilberforce, who was active at the time that Australia was settled, and the views that he was expressing in public. And yet his legacy is extraordinary. The abolition of slavery, indeed the turning around of the idea that slavery was acceptable, education for the poor, even humane treatment of animals. The RSPCA was active on so many fronts. And he made it very plain that his motivation was deeply Christian. Had he chosen to remain private, had he chosen not to be active in the public square, I would argue we'd be the losers. So I actually think there's a great interest in allowing a free and open and robust discussion around deep issues of belief, motivation, good and evil, how we should live.
Absolutely essential, I agree with you. But today we have three very recent attempts to remove religious freedom. I reduced them to 3 R's. One are the reducers, who claim religious freedom is just freedom of worship. And every dictator offers that. In other words, what you believe between your 2 ears, so long as you keep your mouth firmly shut, they'll allow that, but that's nothing. And the UN Declaration is a very expansive, comprehensive view. The right to espouse and practice and share and change your belief, it can't be reduced to freedom of worship. The second little R is the removers. And someone like Richard Dawkins, a classic example. We want to remove religion from public life because it's messy, extremist, violence. And he said he got going as a new atheist after 9/11, when he saw the ugly face of Muslim extremism in the attacks on the World Trade Center. And the third little R, those who call themselves, or are called by others, as the rebranders. In other words, religious freedom is not a positive virtue, it's a way of weaponizing discrimination. So people are hiding behind religious freedom, they say, in order to be against the gays or whoever. And you can see the reducers, the removers, and the rebranders are all over the place in the left now. So religious freedom, which is an incredibly positive idea, and it's for everybody, as you said, is now painted darkly.
You interestingly talk about the two extremes, a sacred public square and a naked public square. I don't think either of us would see those two extremes as desirable. Can you explain what you mean by the naked public square and the...
Yeah, every country has to choose a model, an option for how they put together religious freedom and diversity. And so one extreme, you have the sacred public square where some religion, Christian faith, Islam, Buddhism or whatever, is either preferred or established or even a heavy monopoly. And you've got mild forms of that. The Church of England is a sacred public square. You've got very extreme forms of that, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. People who don't share that faith, they're in trouble for their lives. Take, say, the fate of the Baha'i in Iran. Or you even have Buddhist versions. Take the fate of the Rohingya, who are Muslims, in Myanmar, the former Burma. So that's the sacred public square, which is not just and workable for everybody if you don't share the faith. The other extreme is the naked public square, where all religion's removed in a strict separation, kind of like the French style. But of course, most of the world is religious, 80%. Who knows what religion they believe, but they are religious. And usually when you have a naked public square, you smuggle in secularism and give it a preferred place, that you smuggle them in through the back door. So I would reject both of those and argue for a civil public square, which is a vision of public life in which everyone is free to enter public life, engage public life, based on the dictates of their conscience. That's freedom of conscience. But within a broadly agreed understanding of what is just and free for everyone else too. So I'm a Christian. A right for a Christian is a right for an atheist, is a right for a Jew, is a right for a Mormon or a Muslim, or, God bless him, a Scientologist like Tom Cruise. A right for one is a right for another and a responsibility for everyone. Now, you've got to teach the 3 R's, as they're called, of religious freedom: rights, respect, and responsibility. And if you teach them, then people know how to negotiate. For example, I expect anyone's right to believe what they believe. But that doesn't mean I have to accept what they believe, particularly if they argue for it in the public square, because it might be very damaging to the public good. It might be intellectually muddled. It might be socially disastrous. It might even be morally evil. So I respect the person's right to believe it, but I equally have a right to challenge it and its political implications if necessary. So you need a tough-minded, robust debate along with this acceptance of the 3 R's.
There's a very important point in that, because we've lowered the bar on that tough-minded civic square in this country to say, we're getting to the point now, and this is across the West, Frank Ferrudi's talking about it, where we don't want to offend people. But actually, in any robust civic square dedicated to freedom, the clash of ideas surely means, whilst we should always be against any physical harm or violence, there are going to be times when some people are going to be offended. And in fact, I would say the times in my life when I've had the greatest wake-up calls, I think have probably been when I frankly felt pretty offside with some remark that's been made, even hurt. Are we in danger of, in the name of political correctness, so constipating the public debate by trying to restrict so-called hate speech and so forth, that in fact we kill freedom for those who want to speak?
No, unquestionably. In the last 2 years, I've twice been at the University of Berkeley. And I reminded them, I first went there 50 years ago, and I met Mario Savio, who led the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964. He would be horrified to see what's happening today, because you can see 2 faces of political correctness. One is what I call milk and water. And so you have these areas, safe areas, where students are liable to be offended. They can play with Play-Doh and stuff like this. What absolutely pathetic that we don't have tough-minded, robust discussions. But then you have the sort of blood and iron response, and thugs coming in, beating up voices that they don't like, and even tackling professors, and so on. In the American campuses, you can see both. And many Americans have become highly affrontables. Oh, you offend me, you diss me, and you can't raise anything. This is pathetic. We should have a tough-minded, robust debate. Jefferson says truth wins in debate, and we should have confidence in that.
Strikes me there's a great hypocrisy here, in that many of the people who are pushing this line, we can't offend anyone, and you see it in our universities, microaggression warnings, trigger warnings, safe places, platform denying, you can't be subjected to anything that might offend you. At the same time, often the very people pushing that are using social media and using it disgustingly. The way they sometimes talk about people of different views reflects a deep hatred and a deep rejection of respect for other people. And as Neil Ferguson points out, is frighteningly close to the sort of level of distaste for others that can spill out into violence. So there's a double standard going on here.
And I think our Christian contribution, we have to think through everything biblically today, right down to foundational things like truth, or what you're describing as the biblical view of words. Words are incredibly creative. They created the universe. But in the fallen world, words can be incredibly creative, and they can be incredibly destructive. And the idea that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me, is actually not right at all. And with the social media, the destructiveness and the vehemence of the ad hominem insults and so on is a disgrace. And again, we're followers of Jesus. We have a high view of human dignity, a high view of truth. We should also have a very high view of words, watching our words. I mean, in America, the crude, the lewd, and the rude have just become common. The people think this is freedom. And I'm appalled you take something like the F word. It means nothing in terms of content, but many Christians have it in their sentences routinely, which is appalling. So we've got to think through our words and speak with words that are truthful and gracious and constructive and so on. We've got to make a contribution. Now in America, again, where I'm living currently, it was always said that the election of 1800 was the worst. And however bad things were, they weren't as bad as 1800. But 2016 was worse than 1800. And 2016 wasn't an election, and now we're beyond it, we're back to normal. It's continuing. And the daily viciousness of the assaults is absolutely appalling in Washington, D.C. in America. America is tearing itself apart.
Well, that's not been the Australian way. We need to be forewarned and forearmed, I think, in this country. And I just close off by saying thank you very much. And if anyone doubts that it's real in this country, we need to be alert. It was in the words of that fine young man that you and I met while you were in Sydney, who said he now feels absolutely afraid to speak his mind in his educational setting for fear of being condemned and hacked to pieces by social media. That's not the sort of Australia we want to take forward. No. You've helped us think these things through in your visit here and in this conversation. Oz, you're a true friend to us all. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a privilege. But you remember the words of Pastor Martin Niemöller after the war. You know, we all know people like Bonhoeffer and others, but Niemöller said, they came first for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak up. And then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't Jewish, so I didn't speak up. And then they came for the Catholics, but I was Protestant, so I didn't speak up. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up. So things from the left are getting worse. And it's time for everybody with confidence in the gospel and courage to speak up now, whatever it takes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the example and the model that you've set.
My privilege.